Right. Well, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Thursday, August 19th, 2021 board meeting of SACOG Board of Directors. We will go ahead and begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. And so Mr. Joyner has been speaking a few times. We will ask Director Joyner to lead us in the pledge, please.
Happy to. If you'll all please stand, join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. And let's go ahead and take the roll call, please.
Great, thank you. Before I take roll, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. If you could please mute your device when you're not speaking so we don't get feedback and background noise, we would appreciate that. And if you would like to make a comment during the meeting for our board members, please press the raise hand button so that we can easily track your comments and your wish to speak. If you could please say yes or present when I call your name. Director Baines. Absent. Bernasconi.
Yes.
Bradford.
Yes.
Branscombe. Absent. Boulahan.
Yes.
Burris. Absent. Clark Kretz.
Yes.
Desmond.
Here.
Frost.
Here.
Ialdo.
Yes.
Gog. Absent. Gore.
Yes.
Guerrero.
Here.
Harris.
Yes, good morning.
Jennings.
Here.
Joyner.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
Kozlowski.
Here.
Lozano.
Here.
Middleton.
Here.
New.
Here.
Sander.
Here.
Zaragoza. Absent. Saylor.
Here.
Chenier.
Here.
Spokley.
Here.
Stallard.
Here.
Soon.
Here.
Thomas. Absent. West.
Here.
Thank you. An ex officio member to carve for Benny Paul.
Here.
Here.
Thank you.
Hello.
All right, it looks like we have quorum and we can go ahead and get started. Before we do start, I have a couple of announcements, and I first want to recognize the fires. I know Director Thomas is not with us, and I wasn't sure if Director Zaragoza is with us, but certainly we're all experiencing the effects of the smoke, but please keep them in your thoughts and prayers. I know Placer County had a small fire and we were very fortunate, but if there are ways that you can support those residents and community members, I know there will be opportunities to do so. So just want to keep them in mind. And with that, a few other things, since we do have members who are going to be participating in the GSAC retreat, but I'll start with a couple of my announcements first. And that is we're looking for volunteers for SACOG's nominating committee for the 2022 chair and vice chair positions. And duties of this committee include just reviewing the nominations and making a formal nomination during the election of the December board meeting. So if you're interested in participating in that committee, if you could please let me or Lynette know by September 10th, that would be great. Also, I'd like to report back to the board on the process improvements for the executive director's performance evaluation. The subcommittee, which includes me, Vice Chair Jennings, and Chair Zaragoza, who's the chair of the Policy and Innovation Committee, we're working with CPS HR Consulting to finalize a scope of work. And that scope will include survey work to obtain feedback from the staff, as well as engagement with the board to improve the quality of board feedback, both to and from the executive director. So we'll report back to you as we finalize the work scope and commence the work. And then lastly, I'd like to ask James to introduce SACOG's new SACOG Director of Transportation, Christina Svensk. And I didn't ask how to pronounce her last name, so you'll have to correct me, James, but I'll let you introduce her.
Well, thanks, Chair Gore. We've had a couple of goings this year, but I'm really delighted to announce a great addition to our team and our staff, and that is Christina Svensk. Christina, some of you, or at least your staff, will know Christina because she's been working at WSP here in the Sacramento region for a number of years on a lot of the transportation projects, actually in the region here across 6 counties, even up in the Tahoe Basin. She has fantastic experience, including working a lot of transit experience down in San Diego. And maybe I can just get her to say a quick hello if she is on the line. I thought I saw her.
I am. Thank you. And you did get it right. It's Svensk. I know it's a little challenging, but you perfect. So thank you. Yeah, and thank you, James, for the introduction. I'm just really happy to be part of SACOG and really excited to start working on some of the challenges and opportunities that are presenting themselves to our region. So very much looking forward to getting to know each of you and working together on the many important initiatives that are going to be coming forward soon. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Christina. We're glad to have you aboard. So next we'll have public communication, and this is the opportunity for anyone who wishes to address the board on an item that's not on the agenda. Lynette, did we receive any public comments via email, or is there anybody on the Zoom call who would wish to comment?
We have no public comment.
All right, then let's move to our first item of business, and that's the consent calendar. So does anyone wish to remove an item? And I see Director Frost's hand up. So Director Frost.
Thank you, Chair Gore. I'd just like to pull item number 1 for a slight correction. The sub-motion that I made requested to make some edits to under the activities of the charge to include 3 words, which was equality and the law, those 3 words. And so the verbiage that is written in the minutes does not reflect my what I said in my sub-motion. I wonder if we can correct it.
Of course, Lynette.
Yeah, apologies for that, Director Frost. When I went back and listened to the recording, I used the language that was that our general counsel had repeated back to you, and it didn't include those words at that time, but I can talk to you offline just to make sure that I have that straight, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's just 3 words,
we'll
equality and the law. I wanted to include in the activities in the charge, equality and the law. I just wanted to go on record correctly.
Okay, so we can either approve a motion to amend the minutes with that language, or I can bring that back next month with that correction, whatever is at your pleasure, Chair Gore.
I'm fine if we go ahead and change the minutes to reflect what Supervisor or Director Frost said, and then we can, with those changes, take the consent calendar, if that works.
Thank you,
Supervisor Baines, and I second the motion.
Thank you.
Terrific. So let's just go ahead and make those changes in the consent item, and then let's go ahead and, if there are no other comments on the item for consent, I will, better check with public. Anybody in public wants to remove anything? All right.
No public comment.
Then I'll go ahead and entertain a motion.
I move approval. This is Kozlowski.
Stallard seconds.
And a second from Director Stallard. Roll call, please.
Thank you. Director Baines?
Aye.
Bernasconi?
Aye.
Bradford?
Aye.
Branscombe? Absent Boulahan?
Aye.
Burris? Absent Clark Kretz?
Aye.
Desmond?
Aye.
Frost?
Aye.
Gallardo?
Aye.
Gog? Absent Guerrero?
Aye.
Harris?
Yes.
Joyner?
Yes.
Kennedy?
Aye.
Kozlowski?
Yes.
Lozano, Middleton,
Yes.
New,
Aye.
Sander,
Aye.
Zaragoza,
Aye.
Sailor,
Aye.
Chenier. Director Chenier, if you could indicate your vote, please. Okay. I'll mark him absent.
I'm sorry, aye.
Oh, thank you. Stokely,
Yes.
Stallard,
Yes.
Thune,
Aye.
Thomas, absent. West,
Aye.
Frericks, absent. Vice Chair Jennings,
Aye.
and Chair Gore.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you. Next, we have item 6, which is a discussion about SACOG position on Assembly Bill 1401. And Jav Kedem will present the item.
Right, thank you. And I'm just going to share my screen 1 second. Okay, good morning. This is an action item that the SACOG board take a support position on AB 1401. The Policy and Innovation Committee unanimously recommended the SACOG board take this position. AB 1401 would remove minimum parking requirements on developments that are located near high-frequency transit. I'm going to relatively briefly just kind of go over what the bill does and the rationale behind it. I'll leave ample time for discussion after that. The intention of AB 1401 is to roll back government-mandated parking requirements, which require developers to build a minimum number of car parking spaces as part of their project. And the bill only applies if the project is near high-frequency transit. There's a map in your packet, which is also provided here, that shows where we believe this bill would touch parking requirements. The scope of the bill has been amended a few times, each time reducing the affected areas to a smaller geography. The current language in the bill limits the affected areas largely to transit corridors in the city of Sacramento and Sacramento County, but then to a lesser extent in Rancho Cordova, Folsom, Citrus Heights, and Roseville. So if enacted, projects in the green areas would not be subject to a minimum parking requirement. But to be clear, that does not mean that no parking can be built. It just means that developers would be able to decide for themselves how many spaces they would want to provide. SACOG has spent a lot of time on the topic of housing affordability and how to accelerate housing production in the last couple of years. So starting back in 2019, we had some guest speakers from both the academic and the local development community speak to the board about making infill multifamily pencil, and in particular in our suburban corridors. They had 8 takeaways at the end of the presentation, and 2 of them were to reduce parking requirements and then to reduce parking requirements again. Since then, SACOG has developed several resources exploring the challenges to building more infill multifamily, including the Mind the Gap initiative, which we've talked about this year with the board, but then before that, the Housing Policy Toolkit and the Commercial Corridors Policymakers Toolkit, which came out of the Civic Lab work that we've done. So each of those resources highlight that parking requirements are a significant barrier for building more housing, and that one of the most effective ways that local governments can reduce the cost to produce housing is to reduce or remove parking requirements. So why is SACOG making that policy recommendation? There are 4 big reasons I want to highlight. The first is that parking requirements simply make housing less affordable. Building a parking space is incredibly expensive. Depending upon the configuration, it can be $40,000 per space. And of course, that expense isn't just eaten by the developer, it gets passed on to the buyer or the tenant. For every parking space you add to a project, the average price goes up 15 to 30% per unit. We know from rental rates that each additional parking space adds about $225 on average a month to rent. And then the second reason is that they take up a lot of space, and this is sort of related to the first one, but it's slightly nuanced. The average parking space takes up upwards of 300 square feet, depending upon how much space you need to kind of get into and out of the space. It's not much smaller than a studio apartment unit. So it's a tremendous amount of space, and there's this inherent trade-off there between the car storage and then the thing you're actually parking for, the actual use on the site. Owners' parking requirements reduce the number of housing units that can be built on a typical parcel by about 15 to 25%. So it's not just that it's making the housing that does get built more expensive, it's actually reducing how much housing we're building. So that means less housing where the demand is, that increases housing prices regionally, pushes people further away from their jobs, from their services, which in turn actually makes it harder for us to hit our climate goals as well. The third reason is that parking requirements are static, but parking demand varies pretty dramatically based on a variety of factors: location, proximity to transit, the household size, the income, the ethnicity of the people who live there. And unfortunately, we apply a one-size-fits-all approach to parking, even though developers are targeting these different markets. Static parking requirements, they assume that all people have the exact same travel behavior, the exact same travel needs, but we know that lower income, non-white households, for example, own a lot less cars than affluent white households. Most carless households are lower income and non-white. That's true nationally, that's true in our region. So when we say everyone has to pay for 2 parking spots as a part of their housing costs, it's disproportionately penalizing lower income and non-white households. And then the final point, and this is perhaps the most important one, is that removing parking requirements doesn't mean that we won't have parking. It just means that developers can then tailor the amount of parking that they provide to the actual needs of the project. And this is a little bit of a rough analogy, but government doesn't regulate the amount of closet storage that must be built in every home. But for some reason, it does regulate the number of spaces that we store cars. And it's based on this fear that I think developers would all of a sudden forget to provide parking if government didn't tell them exactly how many spaces they need to provide. And in reality, we know that developers, they're pretty sophisticated. They have an extremely good sense of the market for their product, and they're likely going to provide the right number of spaces based on the price point, the location, all of those factors that we discussed before. So that's all I have for my presentation. Happy to answer any questions about the bill or just open it up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Dov. Appreciate that. I'm going to start with Director Saragosa, who's the chair of our Policy and Innovation Committee, where this item was heard earlier this month. So, Michael.
Thank you, Chair Gore, and apologize for being late. As you can imagine, we're dealing with quite a bit out in Placerville and El Dorado County today, but I did want to say a few words on this bill. So, James and I had a lot of discussion about this prior to it even coming up, and my initial reaction was, I'm not so sure, but the more I started to research this bill, the more discussions we had, I really did take to heart the, let the market decide, what works and what doesn't work in these areas. And we had a really good discussion on this. I think Director Stoller, Director Middleton had some good comments as well while we were discussing this bill. And really, it did come down to, for certain areas, this could very well make sense. I know even in Placerville, even though this bill doesn't affect us, we have to build, sometimes we're building into a side of a hill, and we just know the parking requirements aren't necessarily going to be what are going to be challenging. And something like this could actually be helpful to developers in our area where, you just don't have the same level of vehicles, but that's what is being mandated. And so I saw it as a good first step as we move forward, and really allowing in those transit corridors where we know demographics are switching as well, where we're going to have potentially younger buyers, younger renters that aren't going to be as attached to single vehicles that some of us older folks are. And that these make sense. So I think when we added all those together, that we came out in favor of the bill, and definitely want to hear from those that are going to be directly affected by this legislation as well. But we thought the market approach was appropriate here. So, thank you.
Thank you, Director Saragosa. Director Sander, and then Director Frost.
Thank you. I think, all the work we've done here at SACOG certainly makes the case for why we should be flexible and rethink parking requirements in these sorts of areas. But the giant question for me in the room has not been touched upon at all. Why should we endorse a system that allows the state to mandate this for us instead of allowing each of us to do this on our own. I mean, the case has been made in my jurisdiction. We'd certainly engage in discussion here, but why would I want to hand over my local control on an item like this to the state? Because this is going to undermine my ability to negotiate with those folks who are trying to build in my old commercial corridor. You've just removed a whole area of discussion from what I can do as a local jurisdiction. It's also a little troubling that just a couple jurisdictions are affected, and you know, a whole bunch of others who are unaffected get to decide what's best for me and my jurisdiction. So why do we want to give up local control? That's the big giant question.
Thank you, Director Frost, and then Director Sun.
Thank you, Chair Gore. I'm going to oppose supporting it for basically the same reason as Director Sander described. I like the idea of lowering the requirements on parking and making adjustments in that way, but I think each jurisdiction needs to have local control and make decisions that are appropriate to their jurisdiction. It's not always something that you can judge just based on whether or not there's a parking lot within a half a mile away. I think there's a lot more considerations that might be taken into account when you're trying to determine what those needs are in your own local community. And I think it's important that, you know, we just as a general policy fight to keep local control and make those decisions that are best for our local community. So I'm going to oppose supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Sun, then Director Saylor.
Thank you, Chair Gore. I understand the flexibility that's required. We recently reduced parking requirements on a multifamily project of our own accord. So I have a similar question. I guess, Dov, maybe it's for you, or maybe Director Saragosa, you might have the answer. When you prohibit mandating minimum parking, but does that completely disable the local jurisdiction from negotiating with the developer on parking requirements?
So this bill, to be clear, would preempt the ability of a local government to require parking requirements. There are some exceptions. Local governments still have the ability to require electric charging vehicle parking spaces, and then parking for persons with disabilities, but you would not be able to negotiate on parking requirements. Of course, there are other points of leverage that you would still be able to negotiate with developers on in a discretionary approval process, but it just wouldn't be parking.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Director Saylor, and then Director Kennedy.
Thank you, Chair Gore. A couple of questions I've got. One is, in general, how does our legislative platform and policy for taking positions on legislation come into play with this measure that's before us? I think we adopted a legislative platform earlier in the year, and I'm just interested in understanding if this is consistent with it. If it is, does it require a vote of the board to take a position if the measure is consistent with our established legislative platform? So that's my first question. I think Mr. Saragosa probably has an idea of that. I don't know who else might have it. I think the other part is that this appears to address only a few of the jurisdictions in our region directly, but it allows other jurisdictions to voluntarily take action and gives them freedom and flexibility to adopt to remove this kind of a parking requirement if they choose to. So it seems like it's only a couple of jurisdictions that are directly, immediately affected by the legislation. Am I reading that accurately, Dov? So those are my two questions.
Yes, that's right. And maybe I'll leave the platform question for James or Director Saragosa. But yes, so this bill would only affect a handful of jurisdictions, and The bill does kind of explicitly say that any local government can then pursue reductions or eliminations of parking requirements. But to be clear, that's a power that local governments have right now. You don't need authority from this bill to change your own parking requirements. You can, as local governments, do that at any point.
Director Saylor, on your other question on the platform, this fits squarely into the legislative platform that we've put together, which is pretty broad in general. And often I will work with Chair Saragosa or Chair Gore to send in support letters for things that are very clearly in the scope of that. Obviously, given this discussion, we wanted to bring this through the committee and board process because the policy is good. The question is, do we support the bill that is going to actually, be a mandate from the state? And I think in this, just to be clear, sometimes we want you to have these tough policy considerations and discussions. And this is one of those, as we've said in the past. We don't want to shy away from this, and it's very good policy. So I have a few more thoughts, but just to answer that question.
Thank you, James, and thank you for the questions, Director Saylor. Next, we'll have Director Kennedy and then Director Kozlowski.
Thank you, Chair. So as somebody who represents a district that is impacted as much as anybody, except for probably Supervisor Cerna, and also city council members in Sacramento, I am torn because I have had situations in which parking requirements have made it very difficult to build housing, particularly affordable housing. And I believe that in too many cases we are overparked. So in that sense, I want to support this. On the other side of the coin is, as was stated already by Dov, we already have the ability to do this. So I am not going to support this, though I completely support the policy goal. I'm not sure this is the way to go about it. And I think that what we should do as SACOG is have a discussion of how we can put more pressure on our local entities to reduce parking requirements at that level. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Kennedy. Director Kozlowski and then Lozano.
Yeah, I think for, Folsom would be affected by this directly, and we already have for our historic district, at least, we have a discretionary parking requirement where it can be, reduced when it's useful. But the unintended consequence that will result, particularly for our historic district, which is relatively densely developed already and has a light rail station at one end of it, is that this should apply to it theoretically, right? Conceptually, I think it's a good policy. I agree completely with the other directors who have said that this should be something that should be a question of local control rather than state mandate. And the unintended consequence is that if developers have no motivation to negotiate on parking or perhaps pay in lieu fees or something else, the pressure on public parking on the street and in parking structures that are publicly owned is going to intensify. And we already have a constrained situation in our historic district in Folsom that nobody is happy about. So knowing that someone can come in and, build a large footprint, with layers of legislation now piled up, a large footprint multiplex type housing, affordable or not, on one of the lots in the historic district is going to explode some brains of my constituents. So just FYI.
Thank you. Director Lozano.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Gore. I just wanted to make a point that in the Policy and Innovation Committee meeting that we had where we heard this, I wrote down a note that says it does not restrict the local agencies for requiring minimums. And I've heard something different today, and that may have just been my misunderstanding. I thought this was a piece of legislation that allowed developers a little more flexibility, but maintain local control. And that's not what I'm hearing today. So I don't know that I could support it. Galt is not affected by this, but I certainly see how my colleagues in other areas are affected by it. And Director Sander made a great point, but it certainly was contradictory to what I had heard at the Policy and Innovation Committee. So I'd like to hear more discussion, but I certainly am leaning toward not supporting this today after this discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Lozano. Director Bulahan.
Yeah, I was wondering about the unintended consequences of this, but like where I'm at, as the Folsom person said, like we have a historic district, and we're already complaining about lack of parking. But then we have a small development that's not fully built, and I'm sure there's going to be questions about parking requirements as well.
Yeah, thank you. Other comments or further discussion? I know James wants to make a comment, and I really appreciate the conversation because my first initial reaction to this idea, like Director Saragosa, was, oh no, we want to have local control, and I don't like the idea. At the same time, I can see the need and desire to help actually encourage development, especially when we have a housing shortage. But at the same time, there's that local control issue and not taking away the opportunity for a local jurisdiction to negotiate with a local jurisdiction with the developer so that they can make some progress. It looks like I've got a couple of other comments. So Director Soon and then Director Stollard.
Yeah, Chair Gore, just a further clarification question. Dov, if you could just kind of go into a little bit of the detail about the limitations of this seem to be within projects within half a mile of a transit station for counties of 600,000 or more.
Sure, and I'll do my best to describe it. It's been a little bit of a moving target in terms of the language and where it applies. But so currently the language says that it applies to within a half mile of high frequency transit stations. If you're in a jurisdiction that's within a county of 600,000 or more. In the SACOG region, that's only Sacramento County. And then it also applies if within counties of less than 600,000 people, if you're within a city of over 75,000 people. So that's why Roseville is pulled into the map there. But yeah, so that's where it currently applies.
So you not only within so I'll just take Sacramento County example, but it's within that transit corridor. So if you had a multifamily project, obviously Fair Oaks or something, then it's the normal status quo. Just local control still presides. Is that what I'm hearing?
If within Sacramento County, if you're outside of half of a mile of a high frequency transit stop as defined in the statute here, then yes, it's business as usual. And so there is a very specific definition there of what qualifies as a high frequency transit stop. We've done our best to map it on that in that attachment and in the PowerPoint there. But we can provide a little bit more specificity if you're interested.
Okay, no, I'm good. Thank you.
And just to follow up on Director Soon's questions, you had mentioned something about a city's number of residents in a city. You mentioned Roseville, and I missed the number. So I heard Sacramento County over 600,000 residents, but what was the reference to the city of Roseville?
Yes. So yeah, and sorry, it is confusing. So if you're within a county that the whole county has less than 600,000 people, it applies within a quarter mile of transit stops if you're in a city of more than 75,000 people. And so that's why Roseville is pulled in.
All right, thank you very much. Director Stollard? You're still muted.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate the discussion. It certainly shows the value of our thinking about this collectively. The issue of local control wasn't part of our discussion as I recall it. at the committee level. It was a thought that it's basically good public policy to encourage transit usage, to not fill up all of your land within half a mile of a transit center with parking. It's better to have development there with people living in it that can then go to the transit. So I think it's good public policy. I don't always like the one size fits all approach of the state's thinking, but they can achieve this objective other ways by conditioning the release of funds for transit projects or road projects within half a mile by requiring that we loosen our parking requirements. So there's other ways they can achieve this objective if this legislation were not to be successful. I sort of feel like, listening to the discussion, that maybe there should be no motion on this and we should let it pass. And I would be interested if that's somehow hurts us in terms of how we are regarded across the street. That might be something for James to comment on. But if our support isn't critical, perhaps our concerns should be addressed by no motion at all today. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Director Stallard. Appreciate.
Sure,
Who's
sure,
gonna
Gore.
speak? Yeah,
if I can make
go ahead,
a-
Director Saragosa.
Thank you. Sorry. I was just going to make that exact same, I'm not a motion, but I would suggest, because Director Stallard is right. I mean, we had a conversation more about the really the market and the ability to grow that density in housing around transit corridors as opposed to local control. But certainly from reading and really good comments back to us from our colleagues, that I don't think it's in our, I think it's better that we table this and maybe have further discussions on this bill. Let's see what the final, I mean, obviously there's only a couple of weeks left in the legislative year, but there still could be potential changes to this, or if it gets, tabled for, in discussion next year, depending where this legislation goes. And I know a lot of bills that are part of the overall housing package probably aren't going to see the light of day from my last discussions with folks across the street. And I could certainly see this bill getting caught up in that package of housing, quote unquote, housing bills. So my suggestion would be that we table this bill. But if we want to continue to have discussion, absolutely. But I think it would be best to table at this point.
Thank you, Director Saragosa. And I'm inclined to agree with you as we talk about the local control issue. And I think there are other ways that we can encourage local jurisdictions to look at those parking requirements, and how do we, encourage them to take some looks at it, to be flexible and work with developers as we're trying to bring in new development to our communities. Director Frost and then Director Bradford.
Yeah, I agree. And I also wanted to add that it's my understanding that this bill was placed on Senate suspense on the 16th. So there's a chance it's going to die anyway. It may be a moot point.
Thank you. Director Bradford.
I just wanted to echo the comments that were recently made about maybe taking a no position on this bill. I think it's absolutely good public policy. I think we'd all agree with that. It makes a lot of sense. But I do worry about the local control issue. I don't think any of us like having the state mandate things to us. And so maybe another way to accomplish this with allowing local jurisdictions, encouraging local jurisdictions to implement this policy, but leaving that decision up to them. So I definitely would be in favor of not taking a position of support or opposition to this bill.
Thank you. Director Guerrero.
Sorry for the delay. I looked at the bill. The costs are minimal, it'll likely get out of suspense. The authors are fairly strong, so I think it has a good chance of signing. And so the authors are very progressive. And I just, I don't have a position because it doesn't directly affect me, but, I'm listening to the conversation. And if you can, I'm going to wait for the vote before I take a vote. So if you can come back to me towards the end, I just want to get a sense to where everybody else is at. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Kirk, you can make a comment. I will share this. I think as we look at this, where it only affects Sacramento County, the city of Roseville, I have a hard time saying, hey, let's take a position when we've got a 6-county region and it only affects one county, and very few of our cities. So I'm inclined to table this unless somebody wants to make a motion for a vote. Director or Kirk, you wanted to make a comment, so I'll let you go ahead, and then Director Kretz.
Yeah, just as a matter of process, Chair, what I'd suggest is that you could make the suggestion to table the motion or table the item without objection. If there is objection, what someone could offer is a substitute motion to table the item.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Director Clark Kretz.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Bonnie, listening to this and all of us representing our own jurisdictions and having this really only affect a small number of us just doesn't seem right to me. So I appreciate your comments and I agree with you.
Thank you, Director Gallardo, and then Director Jennings.
Yeah, same message. I think we keep saying it only affects a small number of us, but for now, it only affects a small number of us. It may be others later, but I constantly am fighting for local control. And so this just really goes, well, I support the idea. I want flexibility, but I have flexibility. And I think this goes against the message of local control.
Thank you. Director Jennings.
Yeah, just based on what I'm hearing and that I'm understanding at this point, we want a lot of that the bill has to offer. Lowering the rental costs, removing significant barriers, making infill more affordable. We want all those kinds of things, but at the same time, we also want local control. And it would be my opinion that we do table this motion at this point in time, especially since it has minimal effect on the 6 counties that SACOG represent. It has an effect on 1, and that way gives Sacramento County an opportunity to weigh in, and then we can always come back at this at a later time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And so at this point, I'm going to recommend that we table the item unless there is an objection and somebody would like to make a substitute motion or wants to hear this. So if you want to do something more, let me know, raise your hand. Okay, so we'll go ahead and table the item without objection. I thank you all actually for the robust discussion. I think it's really helpful for us to talk about this and hear everyone's perspectives. So really appreciate that. And I think it is something that we can start thinking about. How do we look at this within our own jurisdictions and start talking about what parking requirements are and how do we work with developers to find a way forward to get projects built. So maybe there's more that we can do with SACOG staff and tools for our cities. But with that, thank you. Yes, James. Sorry, go ahead.
Comment here.
Yeah.
I'm breaking up. I will let me know if I'm breaking up. My internet's not so good. I appreciate the discussion too. And as I said earlier, if we're bringing everything on consensus all the time, I don't think we're doing our job. We want you to take some risks and have some policy debates. And there's going to be, I think, more where good policy, right, sort of butts up against where's that policy coming from and what does it mean for all of us. I do want to make the following comments just to really reiterate this and to tell you how important this is. You all very rightfully are talking about how to lower the cost of housing. We have a housing crisis. Getting rid of parking minimums is one of the best ways to lower the cost of housing. Very few jurisdictions, even in Sacramento County, have done this. The city of Sacramento has done it. There's a vacant lot across from my house for the first time ever. Developers are coming forward with proposals because there are no parking minimums and parking required. They can make it pencil. So completely understand your desire not to have the state tell us to do this. But I also want to bottle up all the enthusiasm we just heard for the policy and for doing it locally, because honestly, it's been something we've been talking about for over 3 years. We have been encouraging this, but I think we need to take a look at ourselves. Housing elements are getting completed, right? Housing elements have to be implemented. We have our Mind the Gap campaign. The Lunar Committee is looking at everything we can do to make housing easier to build, especially infill, attached, in lower VMT areas and green zones. So what I'm hearing, and I want to really capture and take back, is how do we locally get at this? How can we change our policies? And this is the perfect time to be asking those questions. So I just want to say that enthusiasm you all have for doing this locally, I think we're going to need more than we've had in the last couple of years to make that a reality and to be truly rolling out the welcome mat on some of these locations around transit that are more walkable to make housing less expensive. So thank you.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate that. All right, let's go on to our next item, and that is an information item number 7. It's an update on federal advocacy. So Sabrina Bradbury will start the presentation, and we'll be joined by our consultants, Capital Transportation Consulting and Plavchuk and Associates.
Thank you, Chair Gore. Good morning, board members. Sabrina Bradbury, your SACOG staff. Before I kick it over to our federal lobbyist to tell you about all the activity that's been happening in DC, I just wanted to note that the state advocacy update is a receive and file item. Since the legislature just reconvened on Monday, there isn't much to report there. We haven't seen any additional budget action yet. So happy to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to reach out to me or James anytime on the state efforts. But with that, I'll turn it over to our federal lobbyists, Devin Barnhart and Jason Pavlicek.
Hi all, I'm just getting ready to share my screen. I know you all have a time crunch, so I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly. I may skip some parts. I am always happy, Jason is on the call as well, always happy to come back and go into more detail on any of the areas that may be of interest. So as we said, Jason and I are the federal advocates for SACOG in Washington, DC. And one of the things you're going to be hearing in the press, and that you probably already are hearing in the press, is infrastructure. Congress has passed an infrastructure bill, Congress is working on an infrastructure bill, and they're working on another infrastructure bill. The press is calling everything that Congress is working on in the scope of infrastructure, very painful. So I'm just going to go, what do they mean when they say infrastructure? There's two different bills.
Devin?
One is approximately $1 trillion infrastructure, much more massive. Yeah.
Devin, you might want to go on
you
you might want to go on no screen, so you'll have better internet.
Oh my. Okay. I'm gonna start my video. Is that working? Can you hear me now? Oh my goodness.
Give it a shot. Let's see how it goes.
Can you guys hear me now?
That's much better. Yes, thank you.
Guys, sorry. I'm literally sitting on top of my internet. Let me just, someone wave at me if we have a problem. Okay, so things to know about the infrastructure bill. These combined are President Biden's proposal that he submitted as he became president for infrastructure as a whole. The hard infrastructure bill, which is that smaller, approximately $1 trillion one on the left, is all the things you might think of when you think of infrastructure. It's broadband, water and sewer, ports, highways, electricity, resilience money for all kinds of resilience activities across different modes. The bigger piece, this is what they're calling social infrastructure. They also might call it family infrastructure. It's schools, it's pre-K funding, it's healthcare funding. It's a whole host of what some call the social network to support families. That is a much larger bill. One of the big ticket items that are different between the two bills is that the smaller one, the $1 trillion, that's a bipartisan bill. It was negotiated amongst 20 bipartisan senators with the president. And the bigger bill is a Democratic only bill. It does not have 60 votes to get through the Senate, so it's going through a special process called reconciliation. You don't really need to know much about that other than it does require some special rules, and they can't do everything they want to accomplish in that process. And last but not least, the status of the bills. The smaller $1 trillion hard infrastructure bill has passed the Senate. This is a critically important bill to those of us that work in the transportation space. It has passed the Senate. It needs to pass the House. The bigger reconciliation bill is a multi-step process, and it's going to take a little while to get through that process. We are only at the very first step of that. One other thing to flag about these two bills is that they are somewhat linked. They are linked because politically, some folks don't want one to pass without the other. Some folks only want the hard infrastructure bill to pass. That's all a political question that is yet to be resolved about how they are moving forward. But the big takeaway is that they're not going to move immediately. There's going to be a couple of steps. Likely, if they both pass, which is looking like there is a chance that they both pass, it won't be until later this fall. So with that said, I'm going to jump into, there's a small overlap between the two bills. These areas really important to us because it's a lot of the things we care about. In both bills, there is likely to be transit funding, high-speed rail, reconnecting communities. That's where you're taking down, say, a bridge or some other kind of infrastructure that separates communities. A lot of climate funding is likely to be in here, and EV infrastructure. These are all of these items are in the original hard infrastructure bill. They may also be in the reconciliation bill, but the takeaway here is that there's a chance for a lot of money, including additional money that be coming down the line. So for the hard infrastructure bill, just for the hard piece, that's broadband, water, surface transportation, that bill has passed the Senate. It is very exciting. It's a 50-50 Senate. To have such a big funding bill move through the Senate is wildly important and doesn't happen all that often. So it is a big deal. A couple of cautionary notes. It's still in flux. It's unlikely to change, but it could. It's also a gigantic bill. It's 2,700 pages. We have been working our way through all of it. We will have a much more detailed breakdown as we get further through this process. But to let you know, if there are questions or specifics, we are happy to break those down as they come up. Overall, this is a really good bill. There are some complaints in the press.
Chair, can I ask a quick question? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just on the breakdown, what are you looking specifically at what we're eligible for, what the processes will be to obtain the dollars, what kind of local match? Are those the questions that you're asking, and is that a report that we'll see?
That is, we just had this conversation about putting those pieces together. So yes, we are going to be working on all of those pieces, and that's the exact kind of information that we would provide. Happy to provide other information if folks need it as we go along.
And what would be the timeline on that once it passes the House?
We're hoping to have, because it's unlikely to change. I say that with the caveat that it's not passed yet, so it could change. I would say with the because we can see the text now, we can start putting that together now in hopes that we have all of it when it does pass. If anything changes, we could make those edits as we go, but we're going to be working on that right now.
So it would be great, at least for my jurisdiction, if we can see, even if it's a preliminary draft of what that looks like, so we can, because we have lots of different funding sources at this point. We're trying to juggle and make sure we do the right things with the right ones so we can leverage it as much. So the earlier we can see, even again, drafts, the better off we'd be. But thank you.
Great.
Chenier, sorry, just we're working on an analysis, as Devin said, so we should have that sooner. And we're also looking to schedule a board workshop this fall to do a deep dive on this. And obviously happy to work with any of your jurisdictions. There's going to be a lot more competitive grant funds if this bill passes. I'll leave it at that because we're going to have to work together and not individually as a region.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, James.
That's a great point, James, on the regional part. This bill does encourage a lot of regional funding and certainly major urban funding to come together to try and access the various pots of money. So it's a great idea to all be working together as this comes together. Big picture, this is a breakdown of what's in the bill. So normally we have 266 or around $250 billion a year for surface transportation. That's highways and transit money. It's the normal way that all the states, communities get access to transportation dollars. That entire 5-year surface transportation reauthorization is in this bill. On top of that is a $550 billion plus up of additional programs. Half of it, as you can see on this side, is a plus up for transportation in the surface space. So everything from buses, highways, bridges, rail, also airport terminals. The other half of the pot is other types of infrastructure outside of transportation exclusively. So ports, clean, drinking water, wastewater, broadband, electricity, the resilience pot that I mentioned, and a host of a couple other things. That's the big picture spending. To give you a sense of what that looks like in the transportation space, This very first column called FAST Act, that's what we normally give to states every year for a highways, transit, and rail money. It's a pretty, like, relative to these other two pots, it's a pretty small pot of money. It is a significant amount of funding. The House passed the middle column. The Senate deal, that's the one that's most likely to pass right now. That is the far right column. What you can see from here is these are a pretty significant increase in funding. You'll see, particularly in the transit and rail spaces, there are some big bump ups. Same thing in California, because most of this funding, a fair amount of it flows by formula. California sees the same type of increase. One thing to note, this is just the money, this in that last column, that's just the money that goes to highways and transit through formula. California is also eligible to apply for a whole host of other grants that are included in the bill. So this is not everything. Sure, question.
Yes, ma'am. Devin, this is Sean Harris, City Yuba City. Just a quick question for you. Is there any place where an opportunity might live in this bill for funding for regional trails?
Yes. So there's funding within the base surface bill. There's an existing grant, funding program to fund those kinds of trails that exists in the bill. Happy to pull that out when we do the summary so that you can see it explicitly.
Would certainly appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. I'm going to go really fast through these. This is the kind, we will give a much more extensive breakdown, but just to give you a sense of the type of programs that are in here. Multimodal projects, those are things, if you've ever applied for a Tiger grant, it has many names, Tiger, Build, Raise, big influx in money. Same with infra. I know there's a regional infra project. All of those are going to see a big influx of funding. One note, mega projects, which is 100 billion to 500 billion plus. Mega projects, that's a new program. So any like gigantic regional projects, that has a new home. Rail saw a gigantic increase. Just give you a sense, we normally spend about 2 billion to 3 billion on rail. 66 billion over 5 years is a massive amount of funding. It goes through the normal sources of Amtrak and other programs, but the new one to flag is that middle. It's number 3, Fed State for intercity passenger rail. That's where high-speed rail can be funded. Highway programs, there's a whole host of new programs, but the big one here is the bridge program, massive increase in bridge money in the base bill. Transit also saw a very massive increase to what we've normally been receiving. It's not as much as some folks would like. Democrats are hoping to add even more money in the reconciliation package, but these are just some of the places that money can flow. New grants, both are really fun for communities. Safe Streets focus on bike and pedestrian safety. Smart grants, those are innovation. So any of your ITS, smart city type work, there's a new grant program there. Whole host of pay-fors to pay for part of this bill. And then just for you to know, what we will break down is, what does this mean for Green Means Go? What does it mean for SACOG? And what does it mean for your community? So all of that is yet to come. I think we're really close on time. So just to wrap it up, the next step in the process, all of that was that little infrastructure bill. The next big step is that big infrastructure bill. It's a complicated process, but folks are hopeful that it will pass, but it's going to take some time for the committees to move through that. So we'll have a sense over the next couple of weeks what that looks like, and then we'll give you a more specific breakdown on what those programs look like once they're coming to fruition. Okay, any other questions?
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, I see a question first from Director Saylor and then Director Frost.
Thanks, Chair. My question, Devin, is about the reconciliation of differences between the House and the Senate versions. In particular, the House has included member-directed, in quotes, earmark projects in their package that passed and went to the Senate. The Senate, I don't think, included that. What's your sense of how the differences between the two houses will be resolved?
Yes, in that hard infrastructure bill, the $1 trillion package, the House did include earmarks. The Senate did not. The Senate bill is 99.9% likely to be the final bill. So it is very unlikely that earmarks are incorporated into that bill. Chairman DeFazio, who incorporated all of those earmarks, did say that he's going to work with the Department of Transportation to try and help get those projects funded that were submitted, but they will likely have to go through a normal grant process. Of note, the Appropriations Committee, which we did not talk about today, that's the annual funding bill that funds a host of programs. They do have earmarks in various pots of money. So there will still be some earmarks moving forward in that appropriations process.
And one other brief aside is you mentioned the high-speed rail as a project fundable through the IPR piece. And I just want to make sure that we all keep in mind that intercity passenger rail includes the Capital Corridor and the San Joaquin and ACE and other our local California rail service that is highly effective and successful. And I hope we don't just put it all as a high-speed rail issue.
The good news is it's spread across a couple of different programs. So there are the state-supported routes and the long-distance routes have their own pot of funding that doesn't have high-speed rail eligible. So there are different pots that help separate to ensure that all the different types of passenger rail get funding.
Thank you, Director Saylor. Appreciate that, especially because you represent us on the mega region, and there are a number of transportation projects, rail projects in our region that are really important. Director Frost and then Director Soon. And Sue, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Gore. I was wondering on the infrastructure funding, if there's, in our county, there are some areas where we're working on some emergency response, emergency evacuation plans. In my district, Rancho Murrieta is working frantically because we're like a little pocket off, backed up, tucked up into the foothills where there's a lot of biomass and there's only one gate. And they're working on, increasing the number of gates, the ingress and egress, and the path out of there could potentially mimic a car fire where you only have one road out and you can't get out because there's a bog down. And so we're working on an emergency escape plan, but some of the obstacles that they're running into are meaningful, like a bridge that's that doesn't accommodate the necessary traffic on the way to Amador, which would be high ground in a flood or something like that. Will there be funding for those types of projects in this infrastructure bill?
There is significant funding for projects to address resiliency. To give you just a couple of examples, the PROTECT grants are focused on surface transportation. They could, for instance, cover planning or cover construction costs of replacing a bridge. The BRIC program, that's a FEMA sponsored program, also got an increase in funding in this bill. That has like a broader sense of broader planning money, broader community focus for a host of projects. And then I'm trying to think, there's probably another one that would be applicable here, but yes, there is a considerable amount of resiliency money, and happy to break out those pots.
And who should we talk to about that? Who should we meet with to just let them know that we're there, and just to kind of open conversations?
If you aren't already having conversations with the state will have access to a lot of money. Communities themselves will have access to apply for the BRIC program. So I would say in terms of just getting your ducks in a row, I would start lining up all of the communities, all of the local support for addressing it, and then meet with the appropriate federal agency once you have a sense of which pot of money makes most sense for the project.
Okay, thanks. We're already meeting with the state and Fed, but
you're already down the path.
It gives us an idea of what to the buzzwords.
Yeah, the key agencies right now are for this type of project would be FHWA, which is the highways, and FEMA.
Okay, thanks.
And Devin, this is Jason Pavlichuk. I would just add that I know Representative Garamendi actually spends a lot of time and attention in the House bill addressing the evacuation route issue. And I know if it's not satisfied to his and what I would imagine to be your satisfaction, that they will be working on it as a part of reconciliation. So we'll pull those sections and highlight, I think, some of the priorities that were in the House bill and compare to the final language of the Senate bill, and then make sure we call that out for your attention.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. And Director Sin.
Thank you, Chair Gore. Sue, just real quick, the other FEMA grant is a FMA grant. Cal OES is doing a webinar on that next week. So just something else for you to look into. A few things. One, can we get a copy of these slides, Devin? This is very, very good information for us. And if we could get that, that'd be great. And I wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. So it sounded like any earmarks are going to be found in the appropriations, the normal appropriation bills. None of them are going to wind up in the reconciliation process.
Yes, as things stand right now, it is very difficult to put an earmark into the reconciliation process. And in fact, during the American Rescue Plan, which passed by reconciliation, there was a challenge to something that was considered an earmark and it was taken out. So I think it would be very challenging for them to have any specific earmarks. And on the infrastructure bill, also very unlikely given where things stand with the Senate bill. So I would say I put it very much in the unlikely camp. Things could change and we will happily update you if they do, but that's where it stands right now. Appropriations process, if they were submitted through appropes, those are still in play and may still be passed into law at some point.
I see. Okay, thank you. And then finally, if you're able to, because I know reconciliation seems to be a complicated thing, if you could give a little bit more background on this reconciliation process, I would much appreciate that edification.
Sure. This slide right in front of you, this tells you what can and can't pass through reconciliation. Just as a broad rule, reconciliation is changing dollar levels. That's what allows in the bill. There's a whole host of rules that are put into place to protect the minority party because you're taking a vote without their participation. And so there are specific rules around it that require that you're changing revenue levels, you're changing mandatory spending levels. It's best not to think of it as a policy bill. It's a money bill. Very similar to if you saw any of the provisions in the American Rescue Plan, that process passed the same way. And so that's a really good guide. We weren't changing major policy, but we did create new programs. We added money to existing programs, et cetera. There's some other rules that make it a little bit tricky about which committee it goes to. We worry about that, so you all don't have to, but the thing to note is that it has to be in a particular committee in the Senate. You can't do like multi-committee type amendments. So you couldn't have an amendment that hit more than one committee of jurisdiction. It's a strange rule, but that's the process.
As he says, it's a single party thing. You're not doing a normal conferencing type of thing. So that's why they're in effect.
This slide might be helpful. This is the process. We're at number 1 right now, which is that the Senate passed a budget resolution. All budget resolution says is how much money is each committee allowed to spend on certain topics. So the Senate and the House committee have their list of things they are allowed to spend money on. For instance, the Transportation Committee in the House has $60 billion they can spend within the scope of their jurisdiction. There's all these other steps that have to happen. The committees have to write the legislation. They have to move it out of committee. Each chamber has to consider the bill, and then there's a conference. If the language doesn't match exactly, they have to conference to get to an exact space. Then it can be enacted. It's a long process. It can take a number of weeks, maybe months, for it to get through this. So we have a ways to go. We're just at number 1.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Devin, thank you so much. I really appreciate this update and you taking the time to share it with us. It's very helpful for us all, and I think there'll be more to come. All right. With that, we've got reports. I've already given my report. I'll see if are there any directors who have a report they'd like to give before I move on to the executive director report. Director Guerrero?
Yes, we've approved our housing element in July. So we finalized that.
Hooray, that's great. I know a lot of folks are doing that this month. And I think the city of Roseville did it yesterday. So a lot of work, a lot of work. Let's see, then let's go on to James's report. James?
Thanks, Chair Gore. I know we said we would end this early, so just a few quick things, maybe largely in the housekeeping. I do hope you're getting those executive director updates by email. That is part of what, if those are not getting through to you or they're not the kind of information you need, let me know. So most of what I have is in there. Reminders, we will continue to be remote through September. We are aiming and working really hard to get you all together in person October 1st. We know you can't all make that, but the ones of you who were available on that date in Roseville at the grounds for the board retreat, we're really working hard to pull that off, to make it a great event, to have you all meet each other. So keep that in mind. Our Policy and Innovation Committee will meet early next month, actually the end of this month, Monday, August 30th. Within the committees and the September board, and that concludes my report.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it very much. So we'll wrap it up. The remaining items on the agenda are receive and file. And so if there aren't any other questions, we will adjourn the meeting, and our next regular meeting of our SACOG board will be remote, unfortunately, but it'll be remote on Thursday, September 16th. We'll see you then, and hopefully if you can make any portion of the board retreat on October 1st, we would love to have you there. Thank